The sun was setting behind the mesa when John Martinez heard the truck engine coughing down his gravel driveway. He paused, his hand still gripping the wire cutters he'd been using to fix the broken fence post. After 23 years of running the Double M Ranch, he knew the sound of every vehicle that belonged on his property. This wasn't one of them. John wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his work glove and squinted toward the main road. An old Chevy pickup, probably from the early 2000s, was making its way slowly up the drive. The engine was making that particular wheezing sound that meant someone was nursing their vehicle along on prayers and whatever money they could scrape together for repairs. He knew that sound well these days. The drought of 2019 had hit every rancher in the county hard, but John felt like it had singled him out for special punishment. 3 years later, he was still climbing out of the hole it had dug. The cattle market had been brutal, feed costs were through the roof, and the bank loans that kept the operation running also kept him awake most nights, staring at the ceiling and running numbers in his head that never seemed to add up right. But this was his land, the same land his father had worked until the day he died, the same land where John had learned to ride before he could properly walk, where he'd spent summer mornings helping his dad move cattle from one pasture to another, where he'd made the promise to keep the family legacy alive no matter what it took. The pickup truck came to a stop near the main gate, and John watched as someone stepped out. Even from 50 yards away, he could tell it was a woman by the way she moved, careful but confident. She stood beside her truck for a moment, looking around at the property like she was taking it all in, or maybe working up the courage for whatever had brought her here. John set down his wire cutters and started walking toward her. As he got closer, he could see she was probably in her mid-40s, wearing a faded denim jacket that had seen better years, and boots that looked like they'd walked a lot of miles. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and there was something about the way she carried herself that reminded John of the old-timers who used to work the ranches when he was growing up. People who knew hard work and didn't complain about it. "Can I help you with something?" John called out when he was close enough to be heard without shouting. The woman turned toward him, and he could see her face clearly for the first time. She had kind eyes, but there was something else there too. Something that looked like she'd been carrying a heavy load for a long time and was tired of the weight. "Are you John Martinez?" she asked, her voice steady but soft. "That's me. This is my place." John stopped a few feet away from her, close enough to talk comfortably, but far enough to give her space. He'd learned over the years that when strangers showed up at the ranch, it could be anything from someone looking for work to bill collectors, and it was best to feel out the situation before getting too friendly. "My name is Elena Vasquez," she said, extending her hand. Her handshake was firm, the kind that came from someone who wasn't afraid of honest work. "I was wondering if I could talk to you about something. It's important, and I've driven a long way to get here." John looked back toward her truck and noticed the out-of-state plates. New Mexico. That was at least a 6-hour drive from where they were standing in Colorado. Whatever had brought her here, it wasn't a casual visit. "What kind of something?" he asked, not unkindly, but wanting to know what he was getting into. Elena hesitated for a moment, and John could see her choosing her words carefully. "It's about your ranch, your family's history here. And it's about some photographs I have that I think you might want to see." The word photographs caught John's attention. His father had always been camera shy, and the family didn't have many pictures from the ranch's earlier days. Most of what they had were old Polaroids that his mother had taken, faded and stored in shoeboxes in the house. "What kind of photographs?" John asked. "The kind that tell stories," Elena said simply. "Stories about people who lived and worked on this land, about a way of life that's getting harder to find these days." There was something in the way she said it that made John curious, despite his natural caution. The sun was getting lower, and the evening air was starting to carry that October chill that meant winter wasn't far off. Elena noticed him glance toward the darkening sky. "I know it's getting late," she said quickly. And I know you don't know me from anyone, but I've been carrying these pictures around for a long time, and I think they belong with someone who understands what they mean. Someone who knows what it takes to keep a place like this going. John studied her face in the fading light. There was something genuine about her. Something that reminded him of his father's ability to size up a person's character just by looking them in the eye. His dad used to say that honest people had a way of standing that was different from the ones who were trying to sell you something you didn't need. You hungry? John heard himself asking. I was about to head in for supper anyway. Nothing fancy, just some leftover chili and cornbread. But you're welcome to join me if you want to talk about these pictures of yours. Relief washed over Ellen's face like she'd been holding her breath and could finally let it out. I'd like that very much. Thank you. Pull your truck up closer to the house, John said, pointing toward the ranch house that sat about 100 yards away. No point in walking that far in the dark. As Alina got back into her truck, John found himself wondering what exactly he'd just invited into his life. But there had been something in her eyes, something that reminded him of his mother's stories, about the old days when travelers would show up at ranch houses and be welcomed in for a meal and a place to sleep. Back when people looked out for each other, because that's just what you did. The truck followed him up the drive toward the house, its headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. Whatever Alina Vasquez had driven 6 hours to show him, John had the feeling it was going to be more interesting than anything that had happened on the Double M Ranch in quite some time. He just hoped he was ready for whatever story those photographs had to tell. The chili was better than John had remembered making it, probably because he had someone to share it with for the first time in months. Alina sat across from him at the old wooden kitchen table, the same one his parents had eaten at 4:30, years before him. She ate slowly, like someone who had learned not to take hot meals for granted. This is really good, she said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. I can't remember the last time I had a home-cooked meal that wasn't something I threw together in a motel kitchenette. You've been staying in motels? John asked, spooning more chili into his bowl. Alina nodded, looking a little embarrassed. Here and there, sometimes I sleep in the truck when the weather's decent. I've gotten pretty good at finding 24-hour diners and truck stops with clean restrooms. John felt something twist in his chest. He'd been complaining to himself about bank loans and cattle prices, but at least he had a roof over his head and a bed to sleep in every night. How long have you been traveling like this? About 2 months this time, Alina said, tearing off a piece of cornbread. Before that, I was staying with a friend in Albuquerque, but I couldn't impose on her hospitality forever. She's got her own family to worry about. They ate in silence for a few minutes, and John found himself stealing glances at his unexpected dinner guest. Up close, under the warm light of the kitchen, he could see the small details that told the story of her recent life. Her jacket was clean but worn thin at the elbows. Her boots were good quality, but old. The leather cracked in places where it had dried out and been wetted again too many times. Her hands showed the calluses and small scars that came from physical work, but her nails were neatly trimmed, and she wore a simple silver ring on her right hand. You mentioned photographs earlier, John said as he refilled their coffee cups, and something about my family's history. Elena's expression grew more serious. She wrapped her hands around the warm coffee mug like she was drawing strength from it. I used to be a photographer, she said quietly. Professional, I mean. I spent 15 years traveling the rodeo circuit, documenting the people and the life that surrounded it. Rodeo photography, John said, genuinely interested now. That must have been exciting work. It was everything to me, Elena said, and John could hear the longing in her voice. I wasn't just taking pictures of the bull riders and the barrel racers, though I did plenty of that too. I was more interested in the people behind the scenes. The families who'd been involved in rodeo for generations. The ranchers who provided the stock. The communities that built their summers around the circuit. She paused to sip her coffee, and John waited, sensing there was more to the story. I met my husband, Roberto, at a rodeo in Wyoming, Elena continued. He wasn't a competitor, just a truck driver who was hauling equipment for one of the contractors. But he understood what I was trying to capture with my camera. He said I was documenting America's real history, not the version they put in textbooks. Sounds like a smart man, John said. Elena smiled, but it was the kind of smile that carried sadness with it. He was. We got married the next year, and for a while, everything was perfect. He would plan his trucking routes around my photography assignments when he could. We bought a little house in Colorado Springs, nothing fancy, but it was ours. I had a dark room in the basement, and an office where I could organize all my pictures and plan my next projects. She stopped talking and stared into her coffee cup. John could see she was working up to the hard part of the story, the part that had brought her to his kitchen table on this October evening. Roberto died in a truck accident 15 years ago, Elena said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Highway 40, during an ice storm. The police said he probably hit the brakes too hard when a car pulled out in front of him, and the trailer knifed. I'm sorry, John said, and meant it. Elena nodded, acknowledging his sympathy. He was only 4. We'd been trying to have a baby, and I was 3 months pregnant with our daughter when it happened. The funeral expenses, the medical bills from the pregnancy, losing Roberto's income. Everything just fell apart at once. John had seen this story play out in his own community more times than he cared to count. One bad break, one piece of terrible luck, and a family could lose everything they'd spent years building. I had to sell my equipment to pay for the medical bills, Elena continued. All my cameras, my lenses, my darkroom setup, everything. I took whatever work I could find after Lucia was born, but photography jobs are hard to come by when you don't have professional equipment. I ended up working retail, cleaning offices, whatever would pay enough to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads. You raised your daughter by yourself, John said. I tried to give her as normal a life as possible, Elena said, pride creeping into her voice. She's smart, really smart. Made honor roll every semester in high school, got a partial scholarship to college. She starts her freshman year next month at Colorado State. That's quite an accomplishment, John said. For both of you. Elena's smile was genuine this time, but it faded quickly. The thing is, the scholarship doesn't cover everything. Room and board, books, all the extras that colleges don't tell you about when they're recruiting. I've been working 2 jobs for the past 2 years, saving every penny I could, but it's still not enough. John was beginning to understand why Elena had driven 6 hours to find him, why she was sleeping in her truck and eating at diners. And that's why you're here, he said. I've been carrying around a collection of photographs for 15 years, Elena said, looking directly at him now. Pictures I took during my last few professional assignments, before everything went wrong. I've shown them to gallery owners, museum curators, anyone I thought might be interested in preserving that kind of history. Most of them liked the work, but nobody was willing to pay what I needed to make a real difference. She leaned forward slightly, and John could see the desperation she'd been trying to hide behind her calm exterior. I'm not asking for charity, Elena said firmly. These photographs, they're good work. They document a way of life that's disappearing, communities that might not exist in another generation. But I need to find someone who understands their values, someone who knows what it means to keep tradition alive, even when everything else is changing. John felt the weight of what she was asking, even though she hadn't asked it directly yet. Last week, I got an eviction notice for the little apartment Lucia and I have been sharing, Elena said, her voice getting quieter. I've got maybe 3 weeks before we're both homeless, and she's supposed to move into her dorm room in 2 weeks. I can't let her start college worrying about where her mother is going to sleep at night. The kitchen fell silent except for the old clock on the wall, ticking away the minutes. John looked at Elena's face and saw 15 years of struggle, of putting her daughter first, of carrying a burden that would have crushed someone with less determination. "What is it you want me to look at?" he asked quietly. Alina took a deep breath. "Pictures of your ranch, your family. Pictures of your father." The porch light cast long shadows across the yard as Alina led John toward her pickup truck. The October night had gotten cold enough that he could see his breath, and he pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders. Alina walked with purpose. Now, like she'd been building up to this moment all evening. "I keep them in the truck bed," she said, lowering the tailgate with a rusty screech. "I learned a long time ago that motel rooms aren't always the safest place for valuable things." In the back of the truck, secured with bungee cords and covered with an old tarp, sat what looked like camping gear and a few plastic storage containers. But Alina ignored all of that and reached for something else. Something that had been carefully wedged against the wheel well. It was an old canvas sack. The kind that feed stores used to use for grain before everything went to plastic bags. The fabric was stained and worn soft, and Alina handled it like it contained something precious and fragile. 15 years I've been carrying this around," she said, cradling the sack against her chest. "Through 3 different cars, a dozen apartments, more motels than I care to count. There were times when I thought about just throwing it all away, starting fresh without the weight of it. But you didn't," John said. "No," Alina said simply. "I couldn't. These pictures, they're not just photographs. They're proof that something existed, that people lived and worked and cared about things that mattered." She carried the sack over to the porch steps and sat down, patting the space beside her for John to join her. Under the yellow light, she carefully opened the top of the sack and began pulling out plastic-wrapped bundles. "I organized them by year and location," she explained, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "This bundle here is from 1999, mostly rodeos in Wyoming and Colorado. This one's from 2000. When I started branching out to document the ranches that provided stock for the rodeo contractors." John watched, fascinated, as Alina unwrapped the first bundle. The photographs were larger than he'd expected, professional quality. Prints that had been carefully preserved despite their age. Even in the dim porch light, he could see the sharp detail. The way Alina had captured not just images, but moments frozen in time. The first picture showed a cowboy adjusting his hat before a ride, his face a study in concentration and determination. The second was a wide shot of a rodeo arena filled with spectators, but Alina had somehow managed to capture individual faces in the crowd, each one telling its own story of excitement, or worry, or joy. "These are incredible," John said, and he meant it. "You really know how to use a camera." "I was good at my job," Alina said with quiet pride. "Not just the technical stuff, but understanding what made a picture worth keeping. Anyone can take a snapshot, but making an image that tells a story, that's something different." She continued unwrapping bundles, and John found himself drawn into the world Alina had documented. Here was a photograph of an elderly rancher teaching his grandson to rope, the boy's face scrunched up in concentration, while the man's hands guided his small ones. There was a picture of a ranch wife hanging laundry on a line while cattle grazed in the background, the wind catching the sheets like sails. "You weren't just documenting rodeos," John realized. "You were documenting a whole way of life." "That's exactly what I was trying to do," Alina said. "I wanted to show people what it really looked like, the day-to-day reality of ranch life. Not the romanticized version you see in movies, but the real thing. The hard work, the family connections, the pride people took in keeping traditions alive." She reached for another bundle, this one wrapped in extra layers of plastic. "This is from 2001, she said, her voice getting softer. "It was one of my last professional assignments before everything changed." John watched as she unwrapped the photographs, revealing a series of images that made his breath catch in his throat. The first picture showed a familiar landscape, the same hills and pastures he looked at every day from his kitchen window. But These photos were from 23 years ago, when the grass was greener and the fences were newer. The second photograph made John's heart stop completely. There, clear as day in Elena's professional quality print, was his father. Miguel Martinez stood next to the main corral, his hat pushed back on his head, one boot propped up on the bottom rail of the fence. He was watching something off camera, with the kind of patient attention that John remembered so well. His father had been 58 years old when this picture was taken, and he looked exactly as John remembered him during his final good year, before the cancer diagnosis that would claim his life 12 months later. "That's my dad," John whispered, taking the photograph with hands that weren't quite steady. "I thought it might be," Elena said gently. "You have his eyes, and the same way of standing." John stared at the image, remembering that day with sudden clarity. It had been during the fall roundup, when they moved the cattle from the summer pastures down closer to the ranch buildings. His father had been watching John work with a particularly stubborn calf, offering quiet guidance without interfering. It had been a good day, one of many good days they'd shared before everything went wrong. "There are more," Elena said, pulling out another bundle. "I spent 3 days here that October, documenting the roundup and the daily life of your ranch." The next photograph showed John himself, 20 years younger, and full of confidence he didn't even know he possessed. He was on horseback, guiding a small group of cattle through a gate, and the look on his face was one of complete concentration and competence. Seeing himself through Elena's lens was like looking at a stranger who happened to share his face. "You were good at it even then," Elena observed. "Natural horseman, just like your father." There were more pictures, his father and John working together to repair a fence, the two of them sharing coffee on the porch at sunrise, Miguel explaining something to a younger ranch hand while pointing toward the distant mountains. Each image captured a moment that John had forgotten he'd lost, pieces of his father's life that had been preserved by this woman he'd never met until tonight. "Why didn't you ever contact us before?" John asked, his voice thick with emotion. "My dad would have loved to see these pictures." Elena's expression grew sad. "I tried to, actually. I sent a letter to your ranch address about 6 months after I took the photos, asking if your family would be interested in purchasing prints. But the letter came back marked undeliverable. I figured you'd probably moved or changed the mail. Set up somehow." John nodded, remembering. His father's illness had progressed quickly in the spring of 2002, and John had been so focused on medical appointments and treatments that a lot of normal business had fallen through the cracks. Mail had piled up unopened, phone calls had gone unreturned, and by the time John had gotten back on top of things, his father was gone. "I kept meaning to try again," Elena continued, "but then Roberto died, and I had the baby, and everything just fell apart. These pictures got packed away with everything else, and I honestly forgot about them for years." She pulled out one final photograph from the bundle, and John's breath caught again. It showed his father and him standing together in front of the ranch house, both of them grinning at something off camera. Miguel's arm was draped casually over his son's shoulders, and the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows behind them. "This was the last picture I took that day," Elena said softly. "Your father told me that someday you'd be running this place on your own, and he wanted to make sure I got at least one picture of the two of you together." John felt tears threatening and had to look away from the photograph. His father had been right, of course. John was running the ranch on his own now, had been for 23 years. But there had been so many times when he'd wondered if he was doing it the way his father would have wanted, if he was living up to the legacy that had been passed down to him. "He was proud of you," Elena said quietly. "I could see it in everything he did that day, the way he talked about your plans for the ranch, the way he watched you work. He knew you'd take good care of this place." John wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and looked at Elena with new understanding. She hadn't just brought him photographs. She'd brought him back pieces of his father that he thought were lost forever. They sat on the porch for another hour, going through more photographs as the night grew deeper around them. Alina had documented not just John's ranch, but dozens of others throughout Colorado and Wyoming. Each bundle told the story of families who had worked the same land for generations, of traditions passed down from parents to children, of communities built around the rhythm of seasons and cattle, and the hard work that kept it all together. John found himself getting lost in a vision of the world he'd grown up in. She had captured moments he recognized from his own life, the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, the way ranchers looked after each other during tough times, the pride that came with knowing you were part of something bigger than yourself. But as they went through more bundles, John noticed that Elena's hands were getting shakier. She kept glancing toward the bottom of the canvas sack, like there was something else in there. Something she wasn't sure she wanted to show him. "There's more, isn't there?" John asked gently. Elena nodded, her fingers nervously working the edge of a photograph. "There is, but I'm not sure I should show you. I've never shown these pictures to anyone, not in 15 years. Why not?" Elena set down the bundle of photographs she'd been holding and looked directly at John in the porch light. He could see fear in her eyes, the kind of deep-seated fear that came from carrying a secret too heavy for one person to bear alone. "Because I was stupid and young and thought I could change the world with a camera," she said quietly. "Because I believed that documenting the truth was always the right thing to do, even when it put people in danger." John felt something cold settle in his stomach. What kind of danger? Elena reached into the bottom of the canvas sack and pulled out a manila envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with tape that had been reinforced several times over the years. Unlike the other photographs, which had been carefully organized and preserved, this envelope looked like it had been handled with reluctance, like something Elena wished she could forget about but couldn't bring herself to throw away. "Before I show you this," Elena said, holding the envelope against her chest, "I need you to understand something. The day I took these pictures changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. It's the reason I left Colorado so suddenly. It's the reason I never tried harder to contact your family about the ranch photographs. It's the reason I've been running from one place to another for 15 years, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots." John leaned forward, sensing that whatever was in that envelope was the real reason Elena had driven 6 hours to find him. "I was finishing up a job documenting a big ranch operation north of here," Elena began, her voice getting quieter. "The Rocking W Ranch, owned by a family called the Whitfields. They had contracts with several rodeo stock contractors, and they'd hired me to take promotional photographs for their business." John knew the Whitfield name. Everyone in ranching circles did. They owned thousands of acres and had political connections that stretched all the way to the state capitol. William Whitfield Sr. had been one of the most powerful men in the county for as long as anyone could remember. "It was my 3rd day there," Elena continued, "and I was photographing their breaking operation, where they trained young horses for ranch work. There was this kid working for them, couldn't have been more than 19 years old. His name was Danny Reeves, and he was trying to make enough money to help support his family. His father had been laid off from the mine, and Danny was the oldest of 4 kids. Elena's hands were shaking now, and John could see her working up the courage to continue. Danny was working with a horse that was having a bad day. The animal was spooked and unpredictable, and anyone with experience could see it wasn't safe. But the Whitfield's foreman kept pushing him to get back on, kept telling him that real cowboys didn't let horses get the better of them. John had seen similar situations himself over the years. Young men eager to prove themselves, older men who sometimes forgot that pride wasn't worth a trip to the hospital. Usually, cooler heads prevailed before anyone got seriously hurt. "I was taking pictures of the whole process," Elena said, "trying to capture the relationship between the cowboys and the horses they worked with. I had my camera ready when Danny climbed back on that horse for the 3rd time." She stopped talking and stared at the sealed envelope in her hands. What happened? John asked, though he was starting to guess. The horse threw him hard, Alina said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not just a normal fall, but something violent and wrong. Danny landed badly, and when he tried to get up, his legs wouldn't work. I kept taking pictures, because that's what I do when I'm nervous. It's automatic. But I should have put the camera down and helped. John could see tears starting in Elena's eyes. You were doing your job. It wasn't your fault the kid got hurt. That's not the worst part, Alina said. Danny was hurt bad, really bad. But instead of calling an ambulance right away, the foreman told everyone to stay calm, said they'd handle it internally. William Whitfield Jr. showed up and started making phone calls, but not to 911. He was calling lawyers and insurance people. The cold feeling in John's stomach was getting worse. They didn't get the kid medical help. Not for over an hour, Alina said, anger creeping into her voice now. They spent that time trying to figure out how to minimize their liability. Meanwhile, Danny was lying there in the dirt, paralyzed from the waist down, asking why he couldn't feel his legs. Alina carefully peeled back the tape on the envelope, her movements slow and deliberate. I kept taking pictures, she said. The whole time, I kept documenting what was happening. Danny on the ground, the foreman telling everyone to keep their mouths shut, William Jr. making his phone calls. The way they moved Danny before the paramedics arrived, trying to make it look like the accident had happened somewhere else. She pulled out a stack of photographs from the envelope, but she held them face down so John couldn't see the images. When the ambulance finally came, the Whitfields had their story ready. They said Danny had been working alone, that the accident had happened near the barn, that they'd found him and called for help immediately. They had 3 ranch hands ready to back up their version of events. But you had pictures of what really happened, John said. Alina nodded. Every detail. Danny working with that dangerous horse, after being told to get back on. The foreman pushing him to keep trying. The long delay before they called for help. The way they moved him and changed the scene. She looked up at John, and he could see 15 years of guilt and fear written across her face. I thought I was going to be a hero, she said bitterly. I thought I'd take these pictures to the police, and Danny would get justice, and his family would get the money they needed for his medical care. I was so naive. What happened when you tried to come forward? Elena's laugh was hollow and bitter. I went to the sheriff first, showed him some of the pictures. He listened politely and said he'd look into it. 3 days later, 2 men in expensive suits showed up at my motel room. John felt his jaw clench. Whitfield's lawyers. They knew everything about me, Alina said, her voice shaking with remembered fear. Where I was staying, what kind of car I drove, the name of my husband's trucking company. They said I'd clearly misunderstood what I'd witnessed. That my photographs showed a tragic accident that the Whitfields had handled appropriately. Alina pulled out a single photograph and placed it face up on the steps between them. Even in the dim porch light, John could see it clearly. It showed a young man lying motionless in the dirt, while several people stood around him, not helping, just watching and talking. They offered to buy all my photographs and negatives for $50,000, Alina continued. Said it would be easier for everyone involved if there wasn't any confusion about what had happened. But if I insisted on causing trouble, they'd make sure I never worked as a photographer again anywhere in the state. Did you take the money? Alina shook her head. I told them I needed to think about it. That night, someone broke into my motel room while I was out getting dinner. They didn't take anything, but they left everything torn apart, including my camera equipment. The message was pretty clear. She pulled out more photographs, each one documenting a different aspect of the cover-up that had followed Danny's accident. I left town the next morning, Alina said. Drove straight home to Roberto and told him everything. He wanted me to go to the FBI, to the newspapers, to anyone who would listen. But I was scared, and I was pregnant, and I just wanted it all to go away. So you kept the pictures, John said. I couldn't bring myself to destroy them, Alina admitted. Danny deserved better than what happened to him. His family deserved better, but I was too much of a coward to fight people with that kind of power. Alina placed the final photograph on the steps. It showed Danny Reeves being loaded into an ambulance, his young face twisted with pain and confusion, while William Whitfield, Jr. stood in the background, talking on a cell phone. Danny spent 8 months in the hospital, Alina said quietly. His family lost their house trying to pay for his care. Last I heard, he was living in a group home for people with spinal cord injuries, completely dependent on government assistance. John stared at the photographs spread across his porch steps, each image telling part of a story that had been buried for 15 years. In the yellow light, Danny Reeves looked impossibly young, his face full of the kind of trust that comes from believing the world is basically fair, and that people in authority will do the right thing. How old would Danny be now? John asked quietly. 34, Alina answered without hesitation. Same age Roberto was when he died. I've never forgotten that. John picked up one of the photographs, the one that showed the Whitfield foreman, standing over Danny, while the young man lay motionless in the dirt. The indifference on the foreman's face made John's stomach turn. He'd worked around horses and cattle his entire life, and he knew that accidents happened. But what came after an accident? How people responded in those crucial moments? That said everything about who they really were. You know what this reminds me of? John said, setting the photograph back down carefully. Something my father told me when I was about 15 years old. I'd made a mistake with some cattle, left a gate open that I should have secured. We lost about 20 head, and it took us 3 days to round them all up. Alina waited for him to continue, sensing this wasn't just a random memory. I wanted to lie about it. John continued. Blame it on a broken latch, or say the wind must have blown the gate open. But my dad sat me down on this very porch and told me something I never forgot. He said that a man's character isn't measured by the mistakes he makes, because everyone makes mistakes. It's measured by what he does after he makes them. John looked at Alina, seeing her clearly in the porch light. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something else now. Hope, maybe, or just the relief of finally sharing a burden that had been too heavy to carry alone. Your character isn't defined by keeping quiet when you were scared and pregnant and threatened by powerful people, John said firmly. It's defined by the fact that you kept those photographs for 15 years. That you couldn't bring yourself to let Danny's story disappear completely. Alina wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. I've told myself that 1,000 times, but hearing someone else say it makes it feel more true. John stood up and paced to the edge of the porch, looking out at the dark shapes of his cattle in the distance. His father had taught him to think problems through carefully before acting. But sometimes there came a moment when thinking had to stop and action had to begin. I know a lawyer, he said, turning back to face Alina. Her name is Patricia Gonzalez, and she specializes in cases where working people get hurt by negligent employers. She's tough, honest, and she's not intimidated by families with money and political connections. It's been 15 years, Alina said uncertainly. Maybe too much time has passed. Maybe, John admitted, but maybe not. Patricia will know what the legal options are, if there are any, and even if it's too late to file criminal charges or a civil lawsuit, maybe it's not too late for Danny to get some of the medical support he should have had all along. Alina carefully gathered the photographs back into a neat stack. What if the Whitfields come after me again? What if they make good on those threats? John considered this seriously. It was a valid fear, and he wasn't going to minimize it with empty reassurances. They might try, he said honestly, but you're not the same person you were 15 years ago. You're not alone and pregnant and struggling to survive. And they're not dealing with some small-town sheriff who might be in their pocket. Patricia has connections with state investigators, federal agencies if needed. I don't have money for a lawyer, Alina said quietly. Patricia often works on contingency for cases like this. John explained. That means she doesn't get paid unless you win. And besides, I think once she sees those photographs, she's going to want to take this case regardless of the money. Alina looked down at the envelope in her hands, then back up at John. Why would you help me with this? You barely know me. John thought about that question, trying to find words for something he felt in his gut more than understood in his head. Because Danny Reeves could have been me, he said finally. When I was 19, I was working on ranches all over this county, taking whatever jobs I could get to help support my family. I was young and eager, and probably would have gotten back on that horse too, if someone in authority told me to. He sat back down beside Alina, close enough to see the hope and fear warring in her expression. And because my father would have helped you, John added. I saw the way he was in those photographs you took, the way he treated his workers, the respect he showed for people who were doing honest work. If he were still alive, and someone came to him with evidence of an injustice like this, he wouldn't have hesitated to get involved. Alina was quiet for a long moment, and John could almost see her gathering her courage. What happens to me while all this legal stuff is happening? She asked. I've still got 3 weeks before my eviction, and Lucia starts college in 2 weeks. John had been thinking about that too, and he had an idea that might solve several problems at once. I need help with the ranch, he said simply. Real help, not just seasonal labor. Someone who understands the business, who can handle the photography and documentation I need for insurance purposes, marketing. All the paperwork that comes with running a modern cattle operation. Alina looked skeptical. I haven't done professional photography in 15 years, but you still know how, John pointed out. And you understand ranching in a way that most photographers never could. I've been trying to put together a proper archive of the ranch's history, but I never had the skills or the equipment to do it right. He gestured toward the canvas sack full of photographs. What you've got there? That's exactly the kind of documentation every ranch should have. Not just for sentimental reasons, but for practical ones. Insurance companies want to see evidence of proper maintenance and safe practices. Marketing materials need authentic images that show the real story of how we raise our cattle. Alina was starting to look interested despite herself. There's a small apartment above the ranch office, John continued. It's not fancy, but it's clean and private. You could stay there while we work on Danny's case and while you help Lucia get settled into college. After that, we can see how things go. You'd trust me with that kind of responsibility? Alina asked. Alina, John said seriously, you've spent 15 years carrying around evidence of an injustice because you couldn't bring yourself to let it disappear. You raised a daughter by yourself and got her into college while working 2 jobs and living in motels. You drove 6 hours to find someone who might understand the value of preserving ranch history. He picked up one of the photographs of his father and held it up between them. Anyone who could take a picture like this, who could see what was worth preserving and then actually preserve it, that's someone I'd trust with just about anything. Alina looked at the photograph, then at John, then out at the dark landscape that surrounded them. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger than it had been all evening. Okay, she said simply. Let's call your lawyer friend. Let's see if we can get Danny some justice after all these years. And the job offer? John asked. Alina smiled, and it was the first completely genuine smile John had seen from her since she'd stepped out of her truck. I think I'd like to stick around for a while, she said. It's been a long time since I've had a place that felt like it could be home. 3 months later, John stood in the same spot on his porch, watching Alina photograph the morning routine of moving cattle from one pasture to another. She worked with the same professional focus he'd seen in her old pictures, but there was something different about her now. The fear that had shadowed her movements was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from finally doing the right thing. Patricia Gonzalez had taken Danny's case immediately, and while the legal process was still ongoing, progress was being made. The state attorney general's office had opened an investigation into the Whitfield family's business practices, and Danny was already receiving better medical care thanks to a victims' compensation fund that Patricia had helped him access. And documentation of ranch life had proven invaluable in ways John hadn't expected. Insurance companies were impressed by the thorough photographic records of equipment maintenance and safety procedures. A regional magazine had featured the Double M Ranch in a story about preserving agricultural traditions, bringing new customers for their beef. Most importantly, Elena's daughter Lucia was thriving in college, calling home every week with stories about her classes and friends. Elena had been able to visit her twice, driving the same truck that had brought her to the ranch. But now it was mechanically sound, and the back seat was full of care packages instead of all her worldly possessions. As John watched Elena work, he thought about the conversation they'd had on this porch just 3 months ago. Sometimes the most important moments in life arrived unexpectedly, carried by strangers who turned out to be exactly the people you needed to meet. Elena finished photographing the cattle and walked back toward the house, her professional camera hanging from a strap around her neck. When she reached the porch, she held up the camera with a grin. "Got some great shots of that new bull you bought," she said.